greet and welcome our contemporary worship service who are worshiping just across the way, and thank Tony and the guys over there who lead the contemporary worship service and the tech team over there that it takes to do all of this. Also, I want to greet Port Tampa, our Port Tampa congregation, Port Tampa campus, and say thank you to Joe and Linda, and also Corinne, who are leading in worship down there. Thank you so much. We are all going to receive communion together in just a few moments, and just immediately after the sermon, I will offer guidance as to how we in all three locations will receive communion together. And you at home, we hope that you have already prepared your wine and your bread to receive immediately after Pastor Bernie offers the liturgy and invites you to receive. The scripture reading this morning, it comes to us from the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew 23, verses 1 through 12. Will you hear the actual words of the Lord as given to us in the Gospel of Matthew? Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore, do whatever they teach you and follow it. But do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they teach. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on the shoulders of others, but they themselves are unwilling to lift a finger to move them. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. They love to have the place of honor at banquets and the best seats in the synagogues, and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have people call them rabbi. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you all are students. And call no one your father on earth, for you have one Father, the one in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant. All who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Well, what is it about presidential election season that causes many to take leave of our Christ-following senses and suspend our love for others and our love for neighbor? If that neighbor dares to support the presidential candidate or political party that we're not supporting. And my personal observation is our nation is more polarized over politics than any time, I think, in my lifetime anyway. And as I have said earlier, approximately half of you believe that this polarization, this incivility in our political process and in our nation and in our culture today is all caused by the advent of Donald Trump and being elected to president. The other half of you believe the polarization came about because of the policies of the Democrat Party and the last administration. I tend to believe the blame lies somewhere with the tone of our national media and also social media, but that's just me. And most all of us are worried about the future of our nation and feel that this election is the most consequential election in our lifetime. Now, before I continue this message on the eve of our national election, I'm compelled to offer a disclaimer, maybe two. I obviously do have a political philosophy and opinion, and will be voting for one of the presidential candidates. As I've told you before, my undergraduate degree is in political science. I've often been asked, well, what do you do with a political science degree? Go into the ministry, I guess. I don't know. And probably more than I ought to, I pay attention to national, state, and local politics and the outcomes of politics and policy. And I find it fascinating that people with similar backgrounds, similar education, similar faiths, go to the same church. Even people from the same family can have such diverse political views. I try to let my faith grow, my politics grow out of my faith and come from my faith. You know, it would be simple if the Bible tells us that you ought to be Republican or you ought to be Democrat, but it does not. But I do know that there have been, and I've been the pastor of very faithful Democrats and very faithful Republicans. Both parties, both platforms, both policy, both histories of both parties fall short of the principles of our faith. But my political approach is to support a party whose politics and platform does the most good, in my opinion, the most good for the most people most of the time. And policies that uphold the words found in the preamble of our Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights. That's easy for you to say. Unalienable rights. Rights that cannot be taken away, or should not be taken away. That among these rights are life and liberty and a pursuit of happiness. But although I hold political views, I believe it would be inappropriate for me to use this position as your pastor to publicly support a candidate or a political persuasion or a political party or encourage you to. I think most of you are, what I think is this is a very sophisticated congregation, a membership of this church, and most of you are already set in your political approach. And attempting to dissuade you from that one way or another would be a huge waste of time and a huge waste of my breath. Plus, I would alienate probably more than half of the congregation and lose your confidence. So that's not my role as a pastor. But let me also say that I do appreciate the sacrifice of elected service. It's not all bad. Yes, there are those who abuse their position in government. Someone has said the difference between a politician and a statesman is that a politician is concerned with the next election, but a statesman is concerned with the next generation. And I give thanks for the sacrifice of elected service. And if you don't think it's a sacrifice, ask their spouses. And the ones I know personally and have had the privilege of being their pastor have been faithful public servants, in my opinion. Faye Culp, who is a faithful member of this church. She was a retired educator who ran for a state office and was elected as the representative, I think, of this district. I think the districts have changed a little bit since she ran, or since she was elected, but was elected to the House of Representatives in 2002 and served until 2010. A faithful member of First United Methodist Church for many years until they closed, and now she's a member of our church, one of our co-coordinators at Faith Cafe, a faithful follower of Jesus Christ. Johnny Bird, another faithful member of this church, was elected to the House of Representatives out of the district in Plant City in 1996 and served until 2004 when he termed out, but was the Speaker of the House from 2002 and 2004. From 2002 to 2004. Before Vern and Sandy moved to Sarasota, Vern Buchanan, current congressman to the U.S. House of Representatives in District 16 down in Sarasota County, he and Sandy were active and faithful members of my church when I was a pastor of Lake Magdalene. I officiated at both of Vern's parents' funerals. Vern was very successful in business at a very young age and could have just cruised through the second half of his life, but decided to run for office and is serving in Washington instead. All of these are faithful followers of Christ, and I appreciate their service and sacrifice. And listen, we ought to be encouraging other good people to run for office as well. I think there's enough bad people there. We ought to encourage good people and Christians and United Methodists to run for office. And I hope and pray that these three that I've just mentioned are the norm and not the exception to the rule. But I fear that they are the exception. And I think all three would say, if they were here today, the tone and tenor of politics today has become so corrosive. It's tearing apart the fabric of our nation and undermining the foundations that our founders built. So Jesus said to his followers, the Scribes and Pharisees, they are teachers of the law of Moses. What they are teaching is truth and sound principles to live by, but don't act like they act. They don't practice what they teach. They don't themselves live by the principles of their teaching. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on the shoulders of others, but they themselves don't have those burdens, and they themselves are unwilling to lift a finger to assist those who carry those burdens. They do all their deeds to be seen by others. They love to have their place of honor at banquets and love to be invited to parties held by dignitaries. And they love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and have people address them as sir and madam. Jesus said, don't act like them because they teach one thing and practice the exact opposite. They don't practice what they teach. Now, when Jesus referenced the scribes and the Pharisees here and in other passages in the New Testament, he wasn't only speaking of religious leaders. He was speaking about the political class of his day as well. And you couldn't separate the two, actually. The religious leaders, the Pharisees, the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, were also the political leaders. They were one in the same. And this text sounds as if Jesus could be talking about parts of our political class. And it's not, in my opinion, stretching or contorting the text too much to hear Jesus saying to us today, listen, don't act like the political class who devour each other and assassinate each other's character if they have political differences. During the Senate judiciary hearing to confirm Judge, now Justice Amy Coney Barrett, one of the senators was asking a question and was pointing out that Judge Barrett had attacked Chief Justice John Roberts about an opinion that he had written. And Barrett responded, respectfully, Senator, I don't attack people. But when I have grounds to disagree, I attack the idea that has been written. I attack opinions or ideas, but I don't attack people. And I was reminded of the relationship between Justices Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Antonin Scalia while they were both living and both serving on the Supreme Court. Almost always they disagreed in their opinions, but they were the best of friends and their families socialized together. Are we too far gone? Is our nation too far gone in our national discourse to treat each other like Justices Bader and Scalia treated each other with love and respect? So no, I don't think it's a stretch at all to hear this text speaking to us 2 days before our election saying, don't act like them. You must practice what you preach and love your Democrat neighbor and love your Republican neighbor. Elections and politicians will come and go, but your neighbor will continue to be your neighbor. You don't have to agree with them politically. You may think that they are completely misguided and voting for a president and a political party whose policies will take this country down a very dangerous path. Disagree vehemently and continue to promote your political ideas, but don't attack the person. Practice what you preach. The greatest among you, by the way, Jesus said, will be the servant. Practice that. If you exalt yourself over your political adversary, you will be humbled. But if you live lives of humility, you will be exalted. Practice what you preach. Now, even though we are taken aback by some of the negative and nasty campaigning of this and recent election cycles, it just didn't show up recently. Kerwin Swint is a professor of political science at Kennesaw State College and the author of Mudslingers, the 25 dirtiest political campaigns of all time. And he says negative campaigning in the United States can be traced all the way back to the election between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Now, in 1776, Adams and Jefferson were working together to win America's independence, and they had nothing but love and respect for each other. In fact, their families loved each other, much like Ginsburg and Scalia's when they were both families were in France. In fact, Jefferson lost his wife, and the Adams family took him in and gave him much consolation. But by 1800, party politics between the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. Adams was a Federalist. Jefferson was an Anti-Federalist. Had fractured their relationship so much that for the first and last time in U.S. history, a president found himself running against his vice president. Now, they elected presidents and vice presidents a little bit different back then. If you'll remember, Washington was our first president. He served for 8 years. John Adams was his vice president because he was the runner-up. Back then, the one who came in second was the vice president, which would never work today, but that's how it was then. Adams, the second president for one term, was the second president after George Washington, and Thomas Jefferson was the runner-up and VP. But they were on different ends of the political spectrum when it came to federalism, Federalist and Anti-Federalist. So when Adams ran for his second term, Jefferson, his VP, ran against Adams, and things got ugly fast. And they said things that I can't even repeat in this company in a church service. But Jefferson was a good-looking, handsome Virginian, and Adams not so much. And Jefferson's team attacked Adams' manhood. In return, Adams' men called Jefferson mean-spirited. He was a mean-spirited lowlife. Adams, on the other hand, was labeled as a fool and a hypocrite, a criminal and a tyrant, while Jefferson was branded as a weakling and an atheist, a libertine, a coward. Even Martha Washington of all people, was caught up in the nastiness, telling a pastor that Jefferson was one of the most detestable of all mankind. Now, back then, presidential candidates didn't actively campaign. In fact, Adams and Jefferson spent much of their election season in their respective homes, Adams in Massachusetts and Jefferson in Virginia. But the difference in the campaign came when Jefferson hired a hatchet man by the name of James Callender to do his negative campaigning for him. Adams, on the other hand, considered himself above such tactics, which turned out to be a tactical error on Adams' part. Callender's mudslinging proved incredibly effective. He convinced the electorate that Adams would go to war with France if he was elected. The claim was totally false and unfounded, but the truth didn't matter. Voters bought it, and Jefferson won the election. Jefferson served 2 terms as a president, but paid a price for his dirty campaign tactics. Callender served jail time for the things that he had written about Adams. But when he got out of prison, he felt that Jefferson still owed him, and when Jefferson did little to appease him, Callender broke a story in 1802 that Jefferson was having an affair with Sally Heming, one of Jefferson's slaves. And he wrote articles claiming that Jefferson had lived with Heming in France and that she had given birth to 5 children by Jefferson. The story plagued Jefferson for the rest of his career. And although generations of historians shrugged off the story as part of Callender's propaganda, in 1998, DNA testing showed a link between Heming's family and descendants and Jefferson's family. But 12 years after the vicious election of 1800, Adams and Jefferson began writing letters to each other and became friends again. They remained friends and corresponded for the rest of their lives until they both died on July 4th, 1826. They both died on July 4th, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And even, someone has written, even in heated disagreement, there remained a curious respect and affection for one another. And that seems to be lacking in our politics and in our system. The differences between John Adams' Federalist Party and Thomas Jefferson's Anti-Federalist, the strong central government versus states' rights and slavery, was a harbinger, though, of the coming war between the states that cost our nation somewhere between 640 to 700,000 lives. And when the war was winding down, the nation torn apart, Abraham Lincoln was elected to his second term. Abraham Lincoln was our 16th president. And if you haven't read it, I hope that you will Google and read Lincoln's second inaugural address. It's very short. But I want to read just a couple of excerpts from Lincoln. The country was ripped apart by civil war. And this is Lincoln. He said, neither party expected for the war the magnitude and the duration which it has already attained. Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict might cease with or even before the conflict itself should cease. Each looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. Listen, Lincoln said, both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes God's help against the other. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has His own purposes. The Almighty has His own purposes. And then he ended with malice toward none, with charity for all. This was at the end of the Civil War. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work that we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to do all which may achieve and cherish and a just and lasting peace amongst ourselves and with all nations. The second inaugural address by Lincoln was given March 4th, 1865. A little better than a month later, the Civil War ended with Robert E. Lee surrendering at Appomattox. 5 days later, after the Civil War ended, Lincoln was assassinated. What is it about our presidential season that causes many to take leave of our Christ follower senses and suspend our love for neighbor if that neighbor dares to support Donald Trump, or if that neighbor dares to vote for Joe Biden? Listen, I don't know the outcome of this election. I don't know what the outcome will bring. And elections do indeed have consequences, sometimes severe consequences. But our hope is not invested in earthly kingdoms or earthly kings. We are citizens of a different kingdom and serve a different king that has called us all to practice what we preach in every season, including election season. So as we gather at the Lord's table for communion, I encourage you to pray for our nation. Pray for your preferred candidate if you wish, but just know that there will be others praying for their preferred candidate. But I want to encourage you to pray for our nation and pray for yourselves. Pray for yourselves that we who are called by Christ will practice the love of Christ for our neighbor.